Today, we explore the worst crocodile attacks ever recorded, from a man drifting on a floaty into crocodile territory to a tourist's fatal attempt to pet one. But first, we begin along the Zambezi River, where one man's routine journey to feed his family would end in tragedy beneath the murk. It was April 12, 2016, when unusually low water levels for that time of year had reduced the Zambezi River to a shadow of its wet season glory. Weeks of limited rainfall upstream had slowed the river's flow, lowering water levels across wide stretches and exposing sandbars that were normally submerged beneath fast-moving current. Shallow channels formed in areas that had once been deep, forcing both people and wildlife into narrower corridors. For the remote fishing village of Mushumbi, located approximately 40 miles downstream from Kariba, the early dry spell presented both opportunity and danger. Tafadzwa Marambwi was a 34-year-old subsistence fisherman who had lived along the Zambezi his entire life. He supported a family of 7, including his wife, 3 children, and elderly parents who depended entirely on his daily catches for food and income. Fishing near the village had become increasingly poor as shrinking water levels pushed fish into deeper channels farther from shore. Better fishing grounds existed on the opposite bank, but reaching them required crossing a channel approximately 60 feet wide. The village had discussed the danger repeatedly in recent weeks. Elders noted that crocodile sightings had increased as the water receded, particularly near the deeper seams that remained navigable. Livestock had disappeared twice that month, from similar crossing points farther upstream. Still, no alternative fishing ground offered the same yield. Rangers operating upriver had logged 3 confirmed crocodile attacks within the previous 18 months, all occurring at shallow crossings, where receding water forced predictable human movement. None had occurred directly at Mushumbi's crossing point, a fact that contributed to a growing belief among villagers that their route remained safer than others. With food stores already thin and market prices rising in nearby towns, avoiding the crossing entirely was not considered realistic. Tafadzwa had made this crossing dozens of times over the past 3 weeks, always during daylight hours when visibility allowed him to watch for danger. The channel averaged roughly 2 feet in depth across most of its width, with a sandy bottom that provided secure footing in most places, though scoured pockets along the channel seam dropped to 3 feet or more, where current had carved deeper grooves into the riverbed. His routine involved carrying his nets and basic equipment across while moving slowly and deliberately, minimizing splashing to avoid disturbing the riverbed and alerting wildlife. The morning started like any other. Tafadzwa left his home at approximately 6:30 a.m., carrying his fishing nets bundled across his shoulders. 2 other fishermen from the village were preparing to make similar crossings farther downstream, spacing themselves apart as a precaution. The air was still, and the water appeared calm, its muddy brown surface revealing nothing of what moved beneath. Tafadzwa entered the water at his usual crossing point, a location he had used successfully for weeks. The water felt cool against his legs as he waded forward, each step careful and measured. He reached the channel's midpoint, where the bottom dropped into one of the scoured pockets, and the depth increased to approximately 3 feet, the water reaching his upper thighs and slowing his movement slightly. A thin line of reeds on the far bank trembled in the light current, and small fish broke the surface near his knees. Nothing larger showed itself. The crossing had begun to feel routine, and the narrowed channel offered fewer places for danger to reveal itself early. Reduced flow had also intensified current along the deeper seam, creating a subtle downstream pull that concentrated fish and other prey species along that line. Such compression points often become preferred ambush locations for large crocodiles during early dry conditions, when both livestock and people are funneled into limited crossing paths. Nile crocodiles represent Africa's largest freshwater predator, with mature males commonly exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,600 pounds. These apex predators possess the strongest measured bite force of any living animal. Their hunting strategy relies on explosive ambush attacks from concealment, using powerful tail strokes to propel their massive bodies forward with devastating speed. Crocodiles can remain completely motionless and submerged for extended periods, their eyes and nostrils breaking the surface while the rest of the body remains hidden below. During drought conditions, crocodiles concentrate near remaining deep water and known crossing points, increasing the danger for animals and humans forced to move through narrowed channels. A large male crocodile rested in slightly deeper water, roughly 15 feet from Tafadzwa's position. The mature animal had long been associated with this stretch of river, where reduced water levels funneled prey into predictable paths. Tafadzwa's slow movement through the channel had likely drawn the reptile's attention before he reached the deepest section. The attack came without warning. The crocodile surged forward from concealment, sending a violent wave of water across the channel as its massive body lunged. Its jaws clamped around Tafadzwa's right leg, just above the knee, the interlocking teeth driving deep into muscle and biting against bone. The impact knocked him sideways, his nets flying from his shoulders as he collapsed into the water. A single scream carried across the river as the crocodile initiated a powerful roll. The animal spun its body while maintaining its grip, using rotational force to disable its prey. The initial rotation shattered bone and tore through muscle, instantly robbing Tafadzwa of control over his leg. The violent torque of the second rotation wrenched his lower body at an angle the human frame was never meant to endure, causing severe spinal trauma that left him unable to resist as the crocodile pulled him beneath the surface. The fishermen downstream heard the cry and saw the water erupt in violent churn, but they were too far away to see more than flashes of movement and turbulence. The crocodile dragged Tafadzwa deeper, the combined force of the animal's weight and the rolling motion making any recovery impossible. His body, already shutting down from the catastrophic spinal injuries sustained during the roll, took on water rapidly once submerged. Drowning followed within minutes. Less than a minute after the initial strike, the surface grew still. The crocodile had moved its prey toward a submerged log a short distance from the crossing point, an area that offered natural cover as the animal secured the body. The fishermen ran back to the village, bringing dozens of residents to the riverbank. Village elders stopped anyone from entering the water, aware that any rescue attempt would be futile and dangerous given the presence of the crocodile. A messenger traveled to the nearest town with radio access, contacting wildlife authorities by mid-afternoon. A search team arrived the following morning with armed rangers. Tafadzwa's body was recovered from the river approximately 30 yards downstream from the crossing. Officials concluded he had been killed by a crocodile, succumbing to severe traumatic injuries compounded by drowning. The crossing was marked as extremely dangerous, though the village's isolation meant residents would continue facing similar risks. While the Zambezi River had claimed Tafadzwa through a predator acting on instinct, the wilderness of Australia's Northern Territory would soon demonstrate the deadly consequences of ignoring clear warnings. It was November 8, 2015, and the wet season was approaching the top end. The afternoon heat had reached oppressive levels, with temperatures exceeding 95 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity making the air feel thick and heavy. A remote camping area located approximately 15 miles from the main tourist routes near Kakadu had attracted a small group of backpackers seeking authentic outback experiences away from crowded facilities. Darren Holsworth was a 28-year-old backpacker from Perth who had been traveling through the Northern Territory for 3 weeks. His journey represented a gap-year adventure before returning to office work, and he had developed a pattern of seeking increasingly remote locations in pursuit of what he considered authentic experiences. His traveling companion, who remained behind at camp with their equipment, had repeatedly expressed concern about Darren's tendency to take unnecessary risks. The camping area sat roughly 200 yards from a billabong, a seasonal waterhole that had been clearly marked with multiple warning signs. The signs explicitly stated the presence of dangerous saltwater crocodiles and prohibited approaching within 15 feet of the water's edge. Additional signage warned that crocodile activity increased dramatically during dusk and dawn, and that crocodiles were known to move through surrounding grassland between water sources. Darren had spent the day hiking in brutal heat, returning to camp drenched in sweat and eager to explore the area before sunset. Despite his companion's reminders about the warning signs, Darren set off alone toward the billabong to photograph the landscape during golden hour. Rather than following the marked trail, he cut through a stretch of tall grass that grew thick and high along the low ground between the campsite and the water's edge. The grass, fed by seasonal moisture, stood well above waist height in places, obscuring the ground entirely. Visitor briefings distributed at regional ranger stations specifically warned that tall riparian grass should be treated as potential crocodile cover during late afternoon hours. The advisory recommended remaining on marked trails at all times and avoiding low-visibility ground between campsites and water sources. The vegetation also masked subtle depressions in the earth, where larger animals had rested earlier in the day. Rangers had documented several instances that season of crocodiles traveling overland during late afternoon heat to position themselves near shaded ground before dusk. These movements were rarely visible to visitors, as the reptiles remained completely motionless once settled, their broad backs blending seamlessly into mud-darkened grass. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, Darren pushed deeper into the grass. The time was approximately 6:45 p.m., the beginning of peak predator activity. Long shadows stretched across the landscape, and the dense vegetation muffled sound in every direction. Darren moved steadily, his camera in hand, focused entirely on reaching a vantage point near the water. Saltwater crocodiles represent the largest living reptile species, with mature males regularly exceeding 20 feet in length and weighing over 2,200 pounds. These apex predators possess highly developed sensory systems, capable of detecting vibrations and subtle ground disturbances through specialized receptors along their jaws. While primarily aquatic hunters, saltwater crocodiles frequently travel overland between water sources, particularly during seasonal transitions when water levels shift. They are known to rest in dense vegetation near billabongs, their dark, mottled bodies virtually invisible among grass and mud. A saltwater crocodile can launch from a stationary position with explosive speed, covering short distances far faster than any human can react. Their bite force is among the strongest measured in the animal kingdom, capable of inflicting catastrophic, often fatal injuries in a single strike. When encountered on land away from water, crocodiles are more likely to deliver a defensive strike and disengage than to initiate sustained predatory behavior, particularly when startled at close range. A large male crocodile had settled into the tall grass approximately 50 yards from the billabong's edge, resting in a shallow depression where moisture kept the ground cool. The animal had likely moved from the water earlier in the day and remained concealed as the temperature dropped toward evening. Its massive body lay motionless among the vegetation, completely hidden from anyone approaching on foot. Darren was within feet of the animal before anything registered. The crocodile exploded from the grass with terrifying speed, lunging low and striking before Darren could react. The massive jaws clamped around his upper thigh and hip, the interlocking teeth driving deep into muscle and grinding against bone. The force of the strike knocked him off his feet instantly, dragging him to the ground as the animal's weight bore down. The crocodile thrashed violently, wrenching its head side to side while maintaining its grip. The rotational force shattered Darren's pelvis and tore through major blood vessels in the thigh, causing rapid and catastrophic blood loss. His screams carried across the open ground, and voices from the nearby campsite responded almost immediately, shouts and the clatter of metal carrying through the still evening air. The sudden commotion from multiple directions triggered the crocodile's disengagement. Away from its aquatic territory and confronted by additional noise and movement it could not control, the animal released its grip, abandoned the encounter, and retreated low through the grass toward the billabong, disappearing into the water within moments. Darren's companion heard the screams and ran toward the sound, finding him in the flattened grass roughly 100 yards from camp. Other backpackers contacted emergency services by satellite phone within minutes, but the remote terrain delayed responders for over an hour. Rangers arrived equipped to secure the area in case the crocodile remained nearby, but the animal had already withdrawn into the billabong. Darren had lost consciousness before help arrived. He was pronounced dead at the scene from catastrophic blood loss caused by severe injuries to the thigh, hip, and pelvis. Investigators concluded that Darren had left marked trails and moved through dense vegetation in an area with clearly posted crocodile warnings. Officials determined the death resulted from entering known crocodile habitat on foot during peak activity hours, in violation of posted safety restrictions. While Australia's Northern Territory had claimed a reckless backpacker, the riverbanks of Indonesian Borneo would soon deliver fatal consequences to those operating illegally in protected wilderness. It was July 19, 2017, and the humid air of Borneo's coastal mangroves carried the constant buzz of insects and the distant calls of proboscis monkeys. The dense forest formed part of a protected ecosystem, but illegal logging operations had been steadily stripping valuable timber from increasingly remote areas. These operations required crews to move on foot through tangled vegetation, scouting viable trees and clearing access paths before felling could begin. Wiranto Kusuma was a 41-year-old foreman who had been involved in illegal logging operations for nearly 8 years. The Malaysian syndicate that employed him paid far better than legitimate work, and Wiranto had developed extensive experience navigating the dense mangrove interior that made these isolated locations accessible. His crew consisted of 7 men tasked with identifying high-value hardwoods and coordinating extraction routes through the forest. The operation had been active at this location for 5 days, extracting dozens of valuable hardwood logs worth tens of thousands of dollars. Wiranto's role required him to scout ahead of the crew on foot, marking trees and flagging paths through terrain that shifted between firm ground, muddy flats, and dense undergrowth depending on the tidal cycle. His familiarity with the mangroves had bred a casualness around the environment that legitimate operators would never tolerate. That afternoon, Wiranto moved ahead of the crew along a narrow trail roughly 60 yards inland from the main tidal channel. The ground was soft and uneven, thick with decomposing vegetation and tangled root systems. He was marking a route toward a cluster of hardwoods when he noticed a large mound of mud and rotting plant matter rising roughly 2 feet above the forest floor in a small clearing near the water's edge. The mound was approximately 5 feet across, its surface packed with layers of leaves, sticks, and damp soil. Wiranto paused, unfamiliar with the structure. He stepped closer, curious about the obstruction and whether it would need to be cleared for the extraction path. He circled the mound, prodding it with his boot, and noticed warmth radiating from beneath the packed vegetation. He crouched down and began pulling away handfuls of debris, exposing a clutch of pale, leathery eggs partially buried in the decomposing material. The surrounding mud bore faint drag marks leading toward the tidal channel, evidence of repeated movement between water and nest over previous days. Female crocodiles often alternate between submerged rest and land-based vigilance during incubation, adjusting position according to temperature and tidal fluctuation. The afternoon tide had recently receded, leaving the nest exposed and the forest floor damp but navigable. Mature saltwater crocodile females typically reach 10 to 13 feet in length and weigh between 300 and 450 pounds. During nesting season, females construct large mounds of vegetation near water sources, relying on decomposition heat to incubate clutches of 40 to 60 eggs over roughly 90 days. Nesting females are among the most dangerous crocodiles encountered on land, remaining concealed near the nest at all times and responding to any disturbance with immediate, aggressive defense. Unlike predatory ambush attacks, nest defense charges are direct and sustained, with the female committed to eliminating the perceived threat rather than retreating. A female crocodile, roughly 12 feet in length, had been resting in a shallow depression, less than 10 feet from the nest mound, her dark body hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves and mud. She had remained motionless as Wiranto approached, but the moment his hands disturbed the nest material and exposed the eggs, the animal launched. The crocodile charged from concealment with explosive speed, covering the short distance before Wiranto could stand. Her jaws clamped around his right forearm as he instinctively raised it to shield himself, the interlocking teeth driving through muscle and snapping both bones below the elbow. The force of the impact knocked him backward over the nest mound, and the crocodile followed without releasing, dragging him off the far side. 2 crew members working approximately 40 yards behind heard Wiranto's screams and ran toward the clearing. They arrived in time to see the crocodile thrashing violently, her powerful neck wrenching side to side while maintaining her grip on his arm. Wiranto kicked and twisted on the ground, but the animal's weight pinned him as her jaws released his shattered forearm and struck again, clamping across his throat and upper chest. Crushing force collapsed his windpipe and severed major blood vessels. His struggles weakened rapidly. The crew members shouted and threw debris, but the crocodile held her position over Wiranto's body for several moments before releasing and retreating toward the water, positioning herself between the men and her nest. Wiranto lay motionless in the clearing, blood pooling into the soft ground beneath him. He had lost consciousness within seconds of the second bite and died from catastrophic blood loss and airway destruction before the crew could reach him. The crew carried Wiranto's body back to the logging camp, where panicked discussions followed over how to report the death without exposing the illegal operation. By the following morning, fear of criminal charges for failing to report outweighed concerns about the logging itself. One crew member traveled to the nearest village with communication capabilities and alerted authorities. Indonesian wildlife officers arrived later that day alongside police investigators. The illegal logging operation was immediately evident, with freshly cut timber, tools, and transport equipment scattered throughout the protected area. Officers located the nest site and confirmed it as an active crocodile nesting mound, consistent with defensive attack behavior. The investigation led to criminal charges against syndicate leaders, arrests of several participants, and increased enforcement patrols throughout the region. While Indonesian mangroves had claimed an illegal operator through a mother defending her nest, the tidal creeks of Western Australia would soon reveal how quickly calm water could become a kill zone. It was August 22, 2014, and the late dry season had settled over Western Australia's Kimberley region, drawing visitors to the remote gorges and tidal waterways that made the area one of the country's most dramatic landscapes. Temperatures hovered near 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the still turquoise pools that formed along tidal creeks offered what appeared to be inviting relief from the oppressive heat. A remote stretch of tidal creek, approximately 12 miles from the nearest town, had become a popular stop among independent travelers exploring the region by four-wheel drive. The area was not a designated swimming location. No formal signage had been posted along this particular section, though general warnings about saltwater crocodile presence throughout the Kimberley were issued to tourists at regional visitor centers and published widely in travel advisories. Callum Bryce was a 31-year-old carpenter from Adelaide who had spent 6 weeks traveling through northern Australia with his girlfriend, Megan Alcott, 28, a veterinary nurse. The couple had been documenting their trip across social media and had developed a habit of seeking out secluded swimming spots featured in online travel forums. Several posts described this stretch of tidal creek as a hidden gem, though none mentioned crocodile risk. The couple arrived at the creek mid-morning and found conditions that appeared calm and safe. The water was clear in the shallows, the banks were sandy, and the creek stretched roughly 80 feet across with no visible current. Callum inflated a two-person pool floaty they had been carrying since Darwin, and the pair waded into the shallows before climbing on and drifting toward the center of the creek. Megan returned to shore after roughly 20 minutes, uncomfortable with how far they had drifted, but Callum remained on the floaty, lying on his back with his arms and legs trailing in the water as he drifted slowly downstream. Over the next half hour, Callum floated approximately 200 yards from where he had launched. The creek widened and deepened as it curved toward a section bordered by dense mangroves. The subtle current that had seemed harmless in the shallows became more pronounced as the channel deepened. Without paddling or anchoring himself, Callum's inflatable drifted steadily along the outside bend, where erosion had carved a deeper trough beneath the surface. Mangrove roots extended into the water like submerged fingers, creating shaded pockets where larger predators frequently positioned themselves to intercept prey carried by tide or current. The water shifted from clear to murky brown as tidal influence mixed sediment through the channel. Callum showed no sign of concern, drifting lazily with his limbs dragging through water that had become completely opaque beneath him. Saltwater crocodiles' dark coloring renders them virtually invisible in murky or tannin-stained water, and they are capable of tracking surface disturbances from considerable distance. Limbs trailing from the surface create vibrations and silhouettes consistent with typical prey. A saltwater crocodile can strike from directly below with enough force to pull a full-grown adult off any surface-level platform, dragging them beneath the water almost instantly. A large male crocodile had been resting in deeper water, where the creek bent toward the mangroves, roughly 15 feet from Callum's drifting path. The animal had likely detected the floaty's movement and the rhythmic disturbance of Callum's trailing limbs well before it reached striking range. The attack came from below. The crocodile surged upward and clamped its jaws around Callum's right leg just above the knee, the bite force crushing bone and tearing through muscle instantly. The floaty flipped violently as the animal's weight dragged Callum sideways into the water. He surfaced briefly, thrashing, before the crocodile pulled him under with a powerful twist of its body. Megan, watching from the bank roughly 200 yards upstream, saw the floaty overturn and heard a single short scream before the water erupted in violent churning. The murky brown surface made it impossible to see anything beneath. Within seconds, the disturbance moved toward the mangrove edge and the water grew still. Megan ran to their vehicle and drove to the nearest roadhouse, where staff contacted emergency services. Police and wildlife rangers arrived approximately 2 hours later. Search operations began immediately, focusing on the mangrove-lined section of the creek where the attack had occurred. Callum's remains were recovered the following day in deep water near the mangrove bend. Investigators concluded that Callum had entered known crocodile habitat without taking precautions, drifting into increasingly dangerous water on an unsecured inflatable with his limbs submerged. The area was subsequently marked with permanent crocodile warning signage, and regional authorities issued renewed advisories, urging travelers to avoid entering any waterway in the Kimberley, regardless of appearance. While the tidal creeks of Western Australia had claimed an unsuspecting traveler, the estuarine waters of Queensland would soon witness how quickly confidence around wild crocodiles could prove fatal. It was February 5, 2018, and the wet season had turned the coastal waterways of northern Queensland into a network of swollen creeks and flooded flats. Seasonal rains had pushed saltwater crocodiles into areas where they were more visible than usual, basking on muddy banks and resting along boat ramps where warmer ground met the waterline. A public boat ramp located approximately 20 miles north of Cairns had become a popular spot for locals and tourists to observe crocodiles from a safe distance. A large male had been frequenting the ramp for several weeks, hauling out onto the concrete slope during low tide to bask in the afternoon heat. Wildlife authorities had posted warning signs prohibiting feeding or approaching crocodiles, but the animal's predictable appearances had drawn a steady stream of onlookers who photographed it from the parking area above. Rhett Calloway was a 22-year-old backpacker from Manchester who had been traveling through Queensland for 5 weeks. He worked casual hospitality jobs between destinations and spent most of his free time consuming wildlife content online. In particular, Rhett had become fascinated by viral videos showing handlers in controlled environments, touching and even stroking crocodiles that appeared completely docile. Several videos featured individuals approaching wild crocodiles on riverbanks and retreating unharmed, reinforcing the impression that a calm, slow approach could be safe. Rhett had visited the boat ramp twice in the previous week, each time watching the crocodile bask motionless for hours. The animal never reacted to the people watching from the parking area, and Rhett had interpreted this stillness as passivity. Over time, repeated human presence at the ramp had conditioned observers more than the crocodile itself. The reptile's daily basking created an illusion of routine, as though its behavior followed a predictable schedule. Wildlife officers later noted that such predictability often increases risk, as visitors begin mistaking tolerance of distance for tolerance of proximity. He told his hostile roommate that the crocodile was clearly habituated to humans and that the warning signs were excessive. His roommate cautioned him against doing anything reckless, but Rhett dismissed the concern. On this afternoon, Rhett returned alone at approximately 2:30 p.m. The crocodile was resting in its usual position on the lower section of the ramp, roughly 40 feet from the waterline. Its massive body lay motionless, eyes partially closed, jaws slightly open in the typical thermoregulatory posture. 3 other visitors were observing from the parking area above. Rhett moved past them and descended the ramp slowly, his phone held out to record. He approached in a low crouch, stopping roughly 8 feet from the animal. The crocodile did not move. Rhett crouched lower and extended his left hand, reaching toward the animal's tail. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators, whose stillness reflects energy conservation, not docility. Pressure receptors along their jaws and body detect vibrations and movement at close range, even while basking, and a resting crocodile can transition to full attack speed in a fraction of a second, with no telegraphing movement beforehand. Mature males in northern Queensland commonly exceed 14 feet in length and weigh over 1,100 pounds. Videos depicting humans safely touching crocodiles typically involve captive animals in controlled settings, while failed attempts are rarely recorded or uploaded. The crocodile struck the instant Rhett's hand made contact. The animal spun laterally with explosive speed, its massive head whipping around in a movement far faster than its size suggested possible. The jaws clamped around Rhett's left forearm and wrist, interlocking teeth driving through muscle and shattering bone below the elbow. The force wrenched him forward onto the concrete as the crocodile began dragging him down the ramp toward the water. Rhett screamed and braced his feet against the ramp's surface, but the crocodile's power was overwhelming. The animal pulled him across the wet concrete in a series of violent jerks, each tug closing the distance to the waterline. Witnesses above shouted, and one threw a cooler box toward the animal, but the crocodile did not release. Within seconds, it had dragged Rhett into the shallows. Once in the water, the crocodile rolled. The rotational force tore Rhett's forearm free at the elbow, and the animal released momentarily before striking again, clamping onto his shoulder and upper chest. The crushing bite collapsed his ribcage and severed major blood vessels. Rhett was pulled beneath the surface within moments, the churning water staining dark before growing still. Witnesses called emergency services immediately. Police and wildlife officers arrived within 30 minutes, but the crocodile had moved into deeper water. Rhett's remains were recovered the following morning approximately 300 yards downstream. Investigators concluded that Rhett had deliberately approached and attempted to touch a wild saltwater crocodile in violation of clearly posted warnings. Witness accounts and Rhett's own phone, recovered from the ramp, confirmed the sequence of events. Wildlife authorities used the incident to launch a public awareness campaign warning against approaching crocodiles regardless of their apparent behavior, specifically addressing the influence of misleading online content. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.